From Capital News, Illinois, legalized gambling has become a major source of revenue for the state and local municipalities. But for people who can't control their gambling behavior, it's taking a significant toll. Governor J.B. Pritzker has signed legislation aimed at reining in junk fees and ticket scalping, and a handful of other new laws will go into effect next week as the calendar rolls over to a new fiscal new year. It's Friday, June 26th, 2026. We'll talk about those stories on this edition of Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News Illinois. I'm Peter Hancock, and I'm joined this week by our Chicago reporter, Maggie Daugherty, and State House reporters, Brenden Moore and Ben Szalinski. On July 1, 1974, the state of Illinois sold its first lottery ticket. Now, more than 50 years later, state-sponsored gambling has expanded to include slot machines and video terminals, full-scale casinos, and most recently, legalized wagering on professional and college sports. Along the way, it's become a major source of revenue, generating billions of dollars for state and local governments. But that has come at a cost for people who become addicted to gambling. Maggie Daugherty co-wrote a major investigative project looking at the impact of problem gambling and the state's role in it. The stories were done in partnership with the Illinois Answers Project. She's with us here today to talk about those stories. Maggie, thanks for being here.
Hey, Peter, glad to be here.
All right. So there's an old saying in Las Vegas, it's said as kind of a warning to people who go there thinking they're going to strike it rich, that all those luxury hotels and casinos you see on the Strip were not built with the money people won at the tables. Industry profits come from people losing. So when you look at the lottery, the video terminals, the casinos, and now the sports betting, how much money are gamblers in Illinois losing?
Billions, Peter. Just last year, $7.7 billion, really closer to 7.8 is how much people lost on those forms of gambling. That's after payouts back. So people, they do win a lot, but that's really, I think, just there to keep you coming back because the net losses, they are pretty staggering. And that's money that comes out of people's pockets in the local economy. People have, it's really driven by people with addiction in a lot of ways. And that has really major impacts on other aspects of their life. People are getting divorced or getting into legal trouble to finance their gambling. So it's coming out of really all aspects of the Illinois economy.
So out of all those different categories of gambling, the casino tables, the lottery, and let's not forget horse racing, which has been around longer than any of them, what category of gambling seems to be, what's generating the most money for the table owners and what's costing the most for the gamblers?
Yeah, in recent years, that's been the slot machines, especially the ones that are outside of casinos. Those are in gas stations and hotels and bakeries and hair salons and really every corner of the state up till now until Chicago. Chicago's been the largest major holdout, although the city council has recently started approving some licenses for bar and restaurant owners to open up those slot machines. And so Chicago is probably going to be the next place to see a big flood of that. There's also been a pretty dramatic rise in the sports wagering losses, and that doesn't even include the sports wagering that takes place on prediction markets like Kalshi and Polymarket, because those are not regulated by the state and don't report any of that spending. So the slot machines, particularly in downstate and the Cook County callers, have been really what's driving this.
And so what you talked about the 7.7 or $7.8 billion that's being spent, the net loss. What's the state's take on that? What percentage or, what's the state's margin on it?
So last year, the state brought in $2.6 billion in gambling revenues. So, that's not an insubstantial chunk. That is, I think, makes up about almost 5% of the state's budget. So the state's pretty heavily relying on this.
Yeah, the state's budget, just to put it in perspective, the new budget law going into effect next week is about $56 billion. So a little more than $2 billion out of that is coming from the gaming industry. Um, Yeah, I guess one of the points of your story is that, some people can, they can buy a lottery ticket now and then, or they can go out on a weekend and spend $100 at a casino and, just call it a night out of entertainment. A lot of other people can't do that. It affects them differently. How prevalent is problem gambling? And can you kind of describe what it is, really?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll note that the state has not done an assessment of problem gambling since 2021. That report came out in 2022, and it was mostly conducted amid the pandemic before sports wagering had really taken off. So a lot of the people who we spoke to consider the estimates in that report to be a pretty significant undercount, thinking it might even be double. But what the state that found then was that I believe it was about 373,000 people identified as problem gamblers and another 700 something considered at risk. So that's a million people in the state of Illinois, almost one in 10 people who are considered to have a gambling problem or be at risk of developing one. So it was prevalent then, and it's probably even more prevalent now as we've had the expansion of the slot machines as well as the gambling, the sports wagering ads that you see really all over the place. And yeah, so for most people, you can go to a casino and gamble, and it's just a form of entertainment, really. It's a way to socialize. There's people who have a lot of kind of pro-social benefits from going to gamble with friends and stuff like that. But for some people, you just can't step away, and then you're in this kind of pattern of chasing your losses, what it's called, where you lose and then you're trying to make up for the loss. I lost $100. Well, oh, I can make it back. And so you try again and you put bigger and bigger and bigger bets, and suddenly you're spending thousands of dollars. And it's really that the chance wins that people are chasing, and it has the dopamine release in your brain from the potential win is really equivalent to substance use or alcohol, the other kinds of addictions that people struggle with. And so people who we spoke to were spending thousands, even, sometimes $1 million in a year gambling and hiding it from their families. It's in a lot of ways easier to hide than substance use disorders. You don't necessarily have the physical manifestations. And so it's really devastating for people's lives, and not only financially, but it has one of the highest rates of suicide. 1 in 5 compulsive gamblers nationally are estimated to have made an attempt on their own life. So it's a really serious issue, and there's not very many resources devoted to treating it because it's so little sort of known or talked about.
Well, and you talk about the resources being dedicated to treating it. I know that when these bills go through the legislature, there's always some provision in there that some percentage of the state's take will be set aside to fund programs that treat problem gambling. How much is actually being set aside, and is it anywhere close to enough to deal with the size of the problem we've got here?
Yeah, so the amount that's been allocated or budgeted over the past couple years has increased. It was $15 million in the most recent budget and last year's budget, but not all of that actually gets spent. And frankly, most of it doesn't get spent on treatment. It gets spent on these public awareness campaigns. It gets spent on sort of trying to train counselors. But because of the way that the state's reimbursement is set up, people aren't able to essentially charge their treatment to this under the state's Substance Use Disorder Act, because gambling is not considered under the Substance Use Disorder Act at this point in time, which means that only really 1.5 million is being spent on actually treating people, which is, for every $100 in tax revenues that the state brings in, only 6 cents is really going to actually treat people with gambling addiction. And it can only really be applied when people have a coexisting substance use disorder or alcohol addiction, and they get treatment for that. But there is a bill in the state, or actually on Governor Pritzker's desk now, which would reclassify gambling disorder under the Substance Use Disorder Act and make that treatment more available. But it's not been signed yet, so we'll have to see if Pritzker decides to take that up.
Well, I have read that when states first began legalizing lotteries and running their own lottery systems, some of them argued at the time that it was kind of a way of taking the numbers racket out of the hands of organized crime, having the state take it over and running it in a way where at least the revenue off of it, the money generated, would be used for some beneficial social use. But then, we see all this problem gambling that's associated, since, especially since state-sponsored gambling has expanded far beyond that. I guess I'm wondering, does the state share any responsibility for the problems that it's creating, and for, running this operation that basically exploits other people's weaknesses?
I think it's a great question. I think it's a personal maybe decision or take there. I think that we see the state is really profiting pretty largely from this, and we asked people across the spectrum, whether it was compulsive gamblers themselves in recovery or tax experts, this question. Some of the folks who are in recovery from gambling addiction do say the state should not have legalized gambling. It just made it way too accessible. It's, oh, I wouldn't have broken the law had this been illegal. It wouldn't have been so right in front of me like this. Others say, it's better to have it legal than to have bookies breaking people's legs. I think that there's some argument to be made there, but I think it's about the way that, the money's being spent. So one tax expert who we spoke to talked about how putting so much of the state's budget based on gambling or based on anything that's kind of a sin tax like this is not very fiscally responsible, because if things change, if gambling goes kind of out of, popularity, something like that, it's the state is so reliant on this thing. Plus, it does really incentivize the state to promote it. And so the state does have this gambling addiction recovery and resources campaign that it does, where it spends about $4 million putting up the billboards that say, call 1-800-gambler. But it's very small in comparison to the industry ads promoting gambling. And so the experts who we spoke to really suggested that a much larger portion of the money that the state brings in from gambling, if not really all of it, should be devoted to treatment rather than used to fund other services.
All right. Well, it is a fantastic story. It's available on our website, capitalnewsillinois.com. If you haven't seen the story yet, certainly you should go there and take a look at it. Maggie has done a fantastic job along with the Illinois Answers Project. Maggie, thanks for being here, and thanks for sharing your reporting.
Yeah, and if I could say one more thing, there's the policy story we talked a lot about, but the What Gamblers Know piece that we worked on, I think people will find really compelling. We spoke to a bunch of Gamblers Anonymous members, people who are in recovery, who spoke very candidly about their stories, told us about all the highs and lows, and it's very raw. There's beautiful photos from our photographers, and I hope you'll check it out.
And they are extremely touching vignettes of just, how people's lives have been affected by that problem. Thank you very much for sharing your reporting.
Thanks, Peter.
In other news this week, 'tis the season for bill signings in Illinois. Governor J.B. Pritzker has been busy traveling around the state, hosting bill signing ceremonies to enact legislation that passed the General Assembly this past session. On Wednesday, he signed a package of bills putting limits on so-called junk fees that consumers get hit with all the time, as well as some of the practices of the ticket sales industry. Brenden Moore, you wrote about that this week. What are these bills about? What's in them?
Yeah, Peter. So Governor Pritzker and Democrats who control the legislature really leaned into this consumer protection mode this session as part of their affordability agenda. They weren't really able to do a lot of as much direct tax relief as they did in 2022. So this is their way of saying, we're trying to stop the nickel and diming of people by these various industries. The biggest one on this list is House Bill 228, which is a ban on so-called junk fees. It basically makes it unlawful for any business to advertise, display, or offer a price for a good or service that does not include all the mandatory fees or surcharges before taxes. So I was just out in Vegas this weekend. They have what they call resort fees that are on top of your room rate that would apply to this, where you have to disclose that right away, right up front at hotels, or you're going to a ticketed event, any type of like service fee or any other fee that's added on to the actual cost of the ticket would have to be disclosed before checkout. So that was something that has been a goal of the governor and of Democrats. Representative Bob Morgan has sponsored this for a couple of years now, at least. They really had to kind of tinker with it to get a final product, but it is law now. There was another bill, House Bill 4984, would basically prohibit ticket resellers from selling or listing or advertising tickets unless they actually have possession of them. So there's a term called ghost ticketing, which basically means they're advertising that they have these tickets, but they don't actually have these tickets. And it can often lead to consumers paying for inflated prices and sometimes being left without the tickets that they thought that they had bought because sometimes they just can't get their hands on them. Another one, Senate Bill 318, would prohibit the use of bots or multiple accounts to purchase more tickets for an event than the sale allows. I think we've all been in a queue before where we're trying to get tickets for. The example used the other day was a Taylor Swift concert. I was at a Bruce Springsteen concert a few weeks ago where it was the same thing, where you're kind of in the waiting room and you're in line. But the problem is that often you get these bots that make multiple accounts and kind of get in line and prevent folks from getting tickets, and then they can be resold at a higher price. So this tackles that. And then the other one is House Bill 3561, which kind of goes after this buy now, pay later industry, which you'll often see sometimes on Amazon or on some of these other websites where it says, instead of paying the full price now, you can pay in 4 installments of $25 or whatever it is, kind of lessen the burden of the cost. But oftentimes there are these added costs and hidden, I guess, stipulations that people don't always see. And so basically this law would make it unlawful for somebody to act as that type of lender without registering with the state's Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. So it's trying to put some safeguards on an industry that's really grown over the years and people have come to rely on. So the through line here is trying to stop nickel and diming of people by these various industries and ticketing and in hotels and in hospitality. And again, it's a way to maybe not, it's not a big tax cut per se in terms of an affordability agenda, but these are things that people deal with every day. And I think most of us would agree that it's kind of annoying when you get to checkout and the checkout price is much higher than what you originally thought it was going to be.
Well, yeah, I think we've all been through that. Certainly, the hotel industry is notorious for having all kinds of fees. Don't open that little refrigerator that's in your room. But other than the hotel industry, I'm wondering, are there any other industries out there that are especially notorious for having hidden fees?
Yeah, so really anything with ticketed events, sporting events. So you see it with Ticketmaster or even on StubHub. The secondary market is really big. Then another big one is rideshare and some of these food delivery services. So your Uber Eats and and your blanking on the name of another food delivery
DoorDash.
service, but DoorDash. There we go. So they're pretty notorious for adding on extra fees that make it really expensive, and people don't fully know until they get to checkout. So there are a lot of these industries that add these on that they call them junk fees for a reason, because they're listed as, say, like a service fee, or just a surcharge for a convenience fee, and so you find them, they pop up everywhere. But I think for most people, it's probably hotels and ticketed events, and obviously food delivery services have really become a huge part of all people's lives now, and they see it come up there quite a bit.
All right. Finally, this is the week when we get to say Happy Fiscal New Year to all the government and policy nerds out there, ourselves included. Wednesday, July 1st, marks the start of fiscal year 2027 in Illinois. It also marks the effective date of some legislation that's already been signed into law. Ben Szalinski, you've been following this. What are a few of the new laws that are going into effect next week?
Besides the big state budget, of course, there's a handful, a little more than a dozen new laws are taking effect on July 1st. Nothing is really, terribly exciting, but I think a lot of people will probably be excited to see that the pandemic era rule of cocktails to go is now being made permanent. So you will continue to be able to purchase a cocktail from your favorite bar, your favorite restaurant that sells mixed drinks or whatnot, and be able to get it for pickup or delivery. This was created when businesses were closed to in-person customers during the pandemic, and it was a major lifeline to keep a lot of these establishments alive and continuing to function during the pandemic as customers weren't coming in. But this will be now a permanent law here in the state of Illinois. We're also going to see a new state department is officially launching on July 1st. The Department of Early Childhood is a big initiative of Governor Pritzker. This was one of his top priorities for his second term, which is really focused a lot on that early childhood, preschool kind of topic area of state policy. And, this bill, Senate Bill 1, was actually passed back in 2024 to create this department. But, various steps have been taken to kind of ramp this thing up over the last few years. And now it will officially launch as a new state agency beginning on Wednesday. And it will oversee really anything that has to do with early childhood services that's currently spread across multiple state agencies under one roof. So this will include, oversight and funding of preschools, childcare centers, some of those home visit programs, early intervention programs. These are all spread out through other agencies like the State Board of Education, DCFS. Now it's going to be in one place. Then there's a couple of other potentially less exciting things on, new reports that are required at the Department of Corrections on contraband. This has certainly been a big issue, and there frankly has not been a lot of transparency on what exactly is going on in our state prisons around contraband and exposures to both prisoners and staff members at these places. Another new state department that's kind of getting rolling here on July 1st is the Office of State Public Defender. Some of that early groundwork is going to be laid here with a commission that's going to be tasked with identifying a lot of the costs and funding that's going to be necessary to create a statewide public defender office that will take effect at a later date. Finally, probably the most interesting law that's also going to be taking effect here at the beginning of July is regarding AI and bullying. Obviously, this is a growing thing in our society, and this bill is really trying to get at, posting and distributing sexual images, non-consensual false images of students in particular. This legislation is really kind of aimed at categorizing that under the state's existing cyberbullying statute. And that will basically create a way for for schools to be able to punish and deal with this situation, as if a student becomes a victim of a fake cyberbullying incident driven by a fake AI image.
Okay, well, thanks for that update. And that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. I want to thank Maggie Daugherty, Brenden Moore, and Ben Szalinski for sharing their reporting with us. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.